one nation, one temple. You see, and what has come to an end here is one God still holds, but one temple in that original contract with the children of Israel is the one temple period is over. And now the one people period is also over because we're moving into a new covenant. The only piece of that that remains is monotheism. So the temple period, the synagogues became a way of life. The temple had represented laws and doctrines, and Jesus took on the ceremonial activities of the temple. The temple was done. The Hasmonean priesthood is gone. It's done. Sadducees would soon be gone. 100 AD, they were pretty much gone. They ended under the Roman period. The Sanhedrin, interesting enough, regained its former civil power, not just its religious power. So it increased in power about this time. And of course, I mentioned the scribes were active, writing and interpreting. But the people wanted a Messiah. So this period marked a continuing stream of prophetic and messianic interpretations of prophecies. The people, it's written, burned with a sense of destiny, like many Seventh-day Adventists did and do. They yearned for the arrival of a chosen one. And in particular, the Jews wanted justice. They'd been mistreated for so long. They wanted justice. They wanted a Messiah. And they thought it would be a Davidian king, perhaps a ruler like Moses, maybe a military king, but at least maybe somebody from the tribe of Judah, their own person. And they get Jesus, a divine super being, preaching peace, wanting only their hearts and minds, willing to die for his people. The people were confused. This is not what they expected. But from our perspective, what a move by God. That's all I can say. What a move by God. What kind of strategist was he really in terms of timing, place, and person? Jesus seldom referred to himself as a Messiah. He was secretive about that. And even though he was from the line of David, he never called himself son of David. We know that biologically he was the son of God. The rabbis never accepted that. They could never accept a man who would suffer and die for his people. It just wasn't in their background, and it wasn't in their expectations. And you can get into the whole debate of son of man, son of God, son of David, and I'm not going to go there. That's not for me. The Gospels provide Christians with an understanding of who the Messiah was. But clearly Jesus had a disdain for Pharisaical interpretations and rejected them. And Jews, as I said, the Jews, the followers of Christ, the Jews and the followers of Christ would divide, separate themselves. But overall, the Jews were tired of pagan rulers. They are tired of pagan cults. They're tired of being oppressed. They're tired of death and losing their menfolk. And the women in particular were keen to get some relief. And so you've got this emerging interest in an angelic afterlife, a resurrection, an interest in angels, both good and bad. None of these things are found in the Old Testament. But by the time that Jesus arrives, these are actually established concepts in Judaic literature that emerge out of this intertestament period. The time is definitely ripe for a change. Change is coming. Jews were in bondage under Rome, but God be talking to them again? That was the question. Is there a new prophet in the land? Will there be a new kingship in Judah or on earth? And they flocked to listen to Jesus. And John the Baptist turned out some pretty good numbers as well. But my point is, the pump was primed. The time was right. The setting was right. Time in history was right. By the time you get to Matthew, Persians are gone, the Greeks are gone, but the culture lingers, the Romans are entrenched, the Jews are dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, The biggest Jewish populations are in Egypt and Babylonia, but the Jews are in every major Greek and Roman city. That's important. And Matthew is soon writing, he builds close ties with Israel and Moses and Abraham and David. And I say that's very important as well. I revisit as well. And he connects Jesus to the prophets of the prophet Malachi. Not long into Matthew, you read about John the Baptist speaking about that repentance, preparing for a Messiah, and people flock to hear him. There's all this pent-up demand, pent-up expectation through all the trials and tribulations that we talked about for the last 3 or 4 weeks. Sectarianism and the brokenness of Judaism. There was a demand there. But we should never think that the Jews were monolithic. They were entirely sectarian. They were anything but monolithic. They were complex, vibrant, and at times a very fraught people. From his first service, Jesus was not sectarian. He was not politically aligned. He had a whole different message for the people. As I said, I think God was shown to be a very wise strategist for Project Earth. So just in conclusion, the silent years are the not so silent 400 years. When Malachi and Nehemiah went silent, it was as if God stopped talking to the Jewish people. That's what they thought. He'd stopped talking to them. They felt abandoned. But in fact, God never quit on the Hebrew people. There was much writing going on. There was much development going on. And that development of thought and theology is picked up in the New Testament. There's a continuation here. There's no truncation here. So actually, the not so silent years are really not that different to the previous 400 years from a military rule point of view and from a violence point of view, from an occupation point of view. Those 400 years are not that remarkably different at all from persecution. So Christians do themselves a disservice, I believe, by calling this the silent period. The changing rulers, the culture changes, the language changes, Judaism changes, the religious culture changes, there are emerging new groups, there are new writings, new materials, all set up to flow into the New Testament and the stories of Jesus. And it all sets up further conflict. And that's me for the day. And I think Forrest wants to say a few words to introduce what he's going to talk about next week. So Forrest, I punt to you.
Yeah. Okay. Next week we're going to continue. But one of the things that I found interesting is there's silence in certain points in the Old Testament, and by the time you get to Jesus' day, you have a full-blown doctrine, and some of those positions are resurrection, devil and angels, dualism, and very important is apocalypticism, and then messianic desires. These all have evolved during this intertestamental period. And so we're going to take a look at that. I'm going to try to draw connect the dots, because there's been several questions on what is this, so what? And I think there's some interesting points during this period that will create in our minds understanding of how when we get to Jesus' day, that these doctrines and these positions were full blown. So I'm going to just end it right there, Rodney, and let question and answer. David, I'll turn it over to you.
Forrest, what about the point that the following week where you and I will
okay.
do a reflection period and invite people to send to us questions? And
Right. Thank you, Rodney. After next week, we're going to have you send questions. that you would like to have us take a look at in regard to this intertestamental period? Because again, I know that there's been a lot of questions of so what? And so we'll take a look at those, and we'll have kind of a quote unquote panel of looking at those things. So be thinking of what questions you want to ask for the following week, and we'll take a look at them. So. Okay.
All right, thank you both. So next week we'll hear from Forrest. Then the next week after that we'll have a more general discussion, including maybe something like a panel that'll sort of sum things up. Now, the next 3 weeks after that will be Bernard Taylor, and we'll be talking about the Septuagint and looking at that more closely. That'll bring us back a little bit. We'll be turning the film back again, but that's a very important thing, and we want to know, first of all, we want to know how Dr. Taylor became a specialist in the Septuagint. And secondly, we want to know why anybody should read it today. And I think he can help us on those 2 points. And then he has a presentation on different ways of understanding salvation in the Old Testament, the First Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. So we'll go 3 weeks or so on that. Matthew Corkman called me or wrote to me and said he'd like to make a presentation. So that would be good. And Denis Fortin has something by Ellen White and the Apocrypha. So we're going to go a little bit longer. Dr. Brunsma is ready to come back whenever we can get him on postmodernism. So he has a series on that topic in view. All right. We have other people in the room, as it were, who have studied this period, who would like to add something or emphasize something to make it more clear. Here are, I should not say more clear, but more comprehensive. I tried to write down main points from Rodney's presentation, and I came up with 7. 1, Judaism was very, very diverse at that time. Secondly, we need to remember that Jesus was Jewish through and through. Third, the Romans provided much peace and at least some prosperity, and were not entirely bad. In fact, they were in many ways quite helpful to the people, the so-called Pax Romana. Number 4, the temple ceases to be important in the life of the Jewish people. Now, we're getting down past the time of Jesus when the temple's destroyed and so forth, but the basic idea we have is that Jewish people are dispersed. Now, they were really dispersed since the Babylonian exile, right? They never really came back together in full force since then, but now the dispersion takes on further importance. Then we have the growth of the rabbi movement, rabbinism, as he called it. Then what I have is the expectation of Messiah for number 6, but number 7 is this: they were tired. That's the message I got from Rodney toward the end. These people were very, very weary with life as it had continued. Now, I'd like to add just one thing and invite other people to do other things, and that is this expression, Son of God. That raises all kinds of questions about the biological identity of Jesus that I don't want to get into because I don't really know how to answer them. But I do want to point out that this expression, Son of God, in that time was also a political expression. Caesar was the Son of God. In the First Testament, you had rulers who became the sons of God when they became rulers. When Jesus is baptized, the message is, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." So he becomes the Son of God. So when the early Christians said, Christ is Lord, they were saying something very challenging to the idea that Caesar is Lord. So Son of God, when one said that Jesus was a Son of God, in that context, one wasn't making so much of a biological statement as one was making a political statement, which was right in the face of the Caesars and saying, no, Caesar is not God, Jesus is God. And that's a very, very daring thing for for anybody to have said, let alone a relatively weak, very weak Nazarene. All right, anybody else want to add something?
Yeah, I was going to say, David, that the Jews were actually dispersed throughout the known world at the end of the, or during the Assyrian destruction of Samaria. So they, you know, there's been Jews all over the place for 700 years.
Okay, 700 years up to then.
That's correct. Yeah, 722, I think, is when Samaria fell.
Okay.
And we need to remember that Judah was a much smaller kingdom than Israel.
Okay, that's helpful. Anybody else? Want to add something before we get into a more general discussion? I see, you see anybody for us?
I don't. I'm going to suggest again, if you will raise your hand, that would be preferred. But if you just wave your hand on screen, that'll work too. Except I just can't see all the screens that at one time because we got 34 of them. So anyway,
okay, let's work on this together. I thought I saw Juan's hand. Did I see Juan's hand?
Yes, David, that's me.
And I see Juan, and I see Eduardo.
And Bernard, John Teal.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. We've got a queue going.
And Dr. Taylor. So we'll try to remember all you.
Who's first?
Juan, I think. Juan?
I didn't raise my hand. No, I am not on queue.
Okay, all right. Then I guess it would be Eduardo.
David, when the friends of Daniel were thrown into the fire, how did you see the expression of who was it, Nebuchadnezzar, when he said, the fourth one looks like the Son of God? David?
Yeah, I'm pondering. Help me. So we see the picture of what? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fire, and there's a fourth one who says he looks like the Son of God. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Boy, again, I'm going to read that in very political terms, Eduardo. That is, for the ruler to look into those fires and see the Son of God was for the ruler a great, great challenge. It's like saying, there in those flames is my enemy who is more powerful than I am. Now, again, I don't want to talk about, I don't want to say that. I don't want to get into the issue of the biological identity of Jesus because I really don't know what that's all about. But I do know that this expression, Son of God, in addition to whatever else it meant, it had a political impact that is one reason why the Christians got put into the arenas with the lions. It's not because they went around saying, it's nice to be nice to people. It's because they said, Jesus is Lord, Christ is Lord, and Caesar is not Lord. That's what put them in the arena. And the Roman emperors, the people recognized that he indeed was a threat, very important threat. Okay, who's next?
I think Dr. Taylor, did you raise your hand?
Thank you, Rodney, and I'd like to share a few things that I think may be helpful. I've said this several times, but the problem is in our background, there is nothing for it to stick against. And that is the importance of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy stands out from all of the Pentateuch with a different agenda. In the others, you have the sequence that results in the early prophets, as it's called in the Hebrew Bible, our historical books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and it rolls through. And throughout that period, there is the localized worship. And Deuteronomy is different, is written from a different perspective. Deuteronomy has the cities of refuge. It's an urban society. It has a whole different feel. And it is Deuteronomy that calls for the central worship in Jerusalem. Introduced briefly by Josiah, but that passed. But when we come back from captivity, it is the agenda of the book of Deuteronomy, which was centralized and was designed to centralize in one place. And in the light of the centralized worship in Jerusalem, it was the time when the synagogues grew up locally because, as you said, Rodney, very few people could go to the temple, only Jerusalem and its environs. And so there were 3 pilgrimage festivals that were called for, and we see Jesus and his family going down to, or up to Jerusalem for the Passover and so on. And so this was a major change. Now, Deuteronomy allowed for that because in Deuteronomy 14, it allowed the local priests from the shrines to stay locally, and there was a tithe set aside to support them. We know it's, well, it's interesting that it's not a Jewish name. Synagogue, synagogue is a Greek word. And it's interesting that such a word should have been chosen. And so while we're surprised in the first century when Jesus is in the New Testament, the reason for that is not because of the intertestamental period, but because of the book of Deuteronomy, which was instituted in the temple period. I think it's important to keep that in mind. This was something that it is something that stands apart from the rest of the Torah, the first 5 books. Now, in terms of first century Judaism, when one studies the literature and the interests and themes of the rabbis themselves, quite a different picture emerges. And the New Testament is, the Gospels were written in the light of the persecution that you have presented, and they had a not very happy view of it. But this also takes us this time to the intertestamental period. The book of First Maccabees, our source of the history of the time, records that in chapter 8, First Maccabees 8, it was Judas Maccabeus who appealed to Rome to support his uprising. And it says, now Judas, that's Judas Maccabee, heard of the fame of the Romans, that they were very strong and were well dispossessed toward all who made an alliance with them, that they pledged friendship to those who came to them, and that they were very strong. He'd been told of wars and so on, and there's a list of them for quite a few verses. And then verse 12, but with their friends, these are the Romans, with their friends and those who rely on them, they have kept friendship. They've subdued kings far and near, and as many as have heard of their fame have feared them. Judas Maccabeus had no idea what door he was opening when he approached the Romans, and the Romans came and the Romans never left.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting backstory to see what was happening at that time. You talk about the sectarianism, and you might as well be talking about the modern period because Christianity is fragmented so much. And it is very much a picture. But again, you go back to the Old Testament and the Pentateuch is sectarian. We must stand alone. And up until the time of the Babylonian captivity, the message of the prophets was one of uniting, of becoming a nation. And only in the light of that in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, of course, in exile, and Jeremiah immediately preceding the exile, they introduced the element of the individual. And this, of course, continued after that. And then in Isaiah 40, chapter 42 and onwards, the so-called servant songs, here is the message for the return captivities: get outside Jerusalem and Judea and evangelize. Put your focus outside, don't stay inside. And that's as true today. And a final piece of interesting little information, you've been mentioned quite a number of times about Jesus being a Jew, and we never give that any thought, but that is of only recent, that is post-Second World War, in terms of general understanding. And there was an individual called Geezer Vermish. Now, he was Jewish, but he survived the Second World War as a Catholic priest. His mother had the perspicacity to introduce him to there so that he would be safe, and he survived. And then when the war finished, he headed west and ended up in France, and the further west he became, the more Jewish he became. It's a fascinating story that I won't tell, with very unexpected twists and turns. And he finally ended up in Oxford, having divorced his wife and not remarried, and he kept that secret, but he was the one, because of his Christian background in Catholicism as a priest, he opened the world to Jesus the Jew, and it transformed. And when I was in graduate school, we read his work. And I said to my professor, Dr. Kaufman, who is this guy? He didn't sound like a Jew, but he was Jewish. He never responded, and it was quite a while later that I found out. So again, thank you for taking us down these paths. You have covered much, but you have been able to provide a lot of detail for us as in the process, and I hope it will in time spark interest, and more will be learned about it. The more we understand the history, maybe the more we understand why things were the way they were.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. I really appreciate your contribution here today. That was wonderful, and look forward to your own sessions. Appreciate it. I think, David, you're muted, buddy.
Verna, could you give us the name of that author that you just mentioned?
Unmute your mic.
I think we need you to unmute yourself.
I was holding my finger. I forgot that it was Geezer Vermish, Geezavermes. But if you were to write it in the true transliteration, you would put a downward pointing arrowhead above the S, and that's where the Vermesh comes from. I don't have the title with me, but I may be able to find it on the shelf here. And interestingly, I only heard about it at Society of Biblical Literature from a Catholic priest who himself had read the autobiography and opened to me, and I pursued it and was able to find a copy.
Would you take just a couple more minutes, Bernard, and tell us how the book of Deuteronomy came together? You've mentioned its importance, but can you give us some idea of how it was put together in the shape that we now have?
Well, that's sort of like, what's that pink elephant in the center of the room?
Yes, that's right.
And in scholarly terms of the Old Testament, there is the Deuteronomic influence, the Deuteronomic history, because The book of Deuteronomy is distinctive. Its message is, it's not that hard. You can do it. Just be obedient and follow along in the schedule. And if you do, and book of Deuteronomy for a long time wasn't understood until we found the Hittite suzerain treaties, the Hittite rulership treaties that they made amongst themselves. And the book of Deuteronomy falls pretty neatly into that pattern. So the suzerain makes the terms and says what the vassal will do, and then they enter into this treaty, and then it ends with blessings and cursings. Blessings if they keep it, and curses if they don't. And of course, that's where the book of Deuteronomy also ends up. And the message is, and it's the message that has caught the most and is preached most strongly by televangelists. If you serve God, you will be blessed, everything will go well. And if things are not going well, it's your fault, you're not doing the right thing. And that's a summary of so much Christianity. And Deuteronomy was in that perspective. And the books of Samuel Kings, for instance, judge along this standard. And the Deuteronomic history is a pervading influence over those books and how the events of the Old Testament are interpreted. And because they were written from the perspective of the south of Judah, Israel never gets a passing grade. The best that anyone got was the least of the worst. That's as far as they could go because of the idolatry that persisted in the north. And there is, of course, a history behind that. So this is the powerful influence that Deuteronomy is. Now, I never heard this in any Adventist education. It was just read in there as the passing remarks of Moses at his death, his last message. But in fact, it's a manifesto, an agenda that was, and when it's attributed to Moses, I think it's fair to say that those who wrote it believed they were writing in the, as the successors of Moses with the concerns he would have in the current context, which is now urban, it's city life, and so was easily transferred to Jerusalem when they returned from captivity because it's centralized.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Dr. Taylor. I think I'd like to go to John Teal right now. Need to unmute yourself, John.
Rodney, I was particularly interested when you talked about Jews being, I guess, enslaved or forced to work for someone. I didn't think, I had never heard of that occurring. Let me just say some more. Aside from the fact that the pride of Jews was hurt, and they didn't control the laws and that sort of thing. I didn't see why it was so bad having a Roman as your captor, as long as you obeyed the rules. You weren't going to have bandits rampaging through your countryside or your cities. Your boys weren't going to be drafted into some foreign army. But now that I hear you talking about enslavement, that makes me think that perhaps there was some reason for their bitterness. Could you elaborate on what kind of, was it involuntary servitude or enslavement or just what was it?
I can only elaborate a little bit more, and I'd look to class members that are more maybe theologically driven or historically driven than myself here. You know, and that is that the enslavement, I mean, you have to think in terms of who was doing all the manual work that the Romans, the roads, the buildings, and all that kind of stuff that was going on. If you talk to Jews, they weren't bringing down Roman contract workers and bricklayers from Rome to do this. They were using local people that were indentured, that were enslaved, that were instructed what to do. Yes, there was a lot of backloading. This Titus, 90,000 people sold, not put into slavery, sold into slavery for a price. Some of them, from what I read, were allowed to have possessions. Some of them had certain rights. There seemed to be like a tier, a structure here. You started off mentioning that, yes, the Romans did bring an enforceable peace. That was a positive thing. But there was a lot of zealots here. And I'm not quite sure, I have to play the game. Where would I be in this here? I don't work well as an indentured servant. I certainly don't work well. I wouldn't work well in any kind of enslavement. I'm too much my own person. I'm into self-expression and personal growth and responsibility. And so even if my captors were somewhat benevolent, it would rankle me. I so prize freedom. And that's partly why I came to this country. Was Americans prize freedom. I was drawn here. I didn't talk about freedom until I came to this country and learned to value it. And therefore, anything that threatens American freedom threatens me now. It's a very personal thing, this issue called freedom. But I do believe and understand that widely practiced throughout this region for centuries, maybe going back to almost time immemorial, there were this issue of slaves and enslavement. And in many ways, I think that history is suppressed and is understated by historians. But I'll leave this open to someone else to respond.
Okay, thank you.
I would say, though, I don't think the Jews were unique. This was a practice all throughout the Roman Empire. I understand 1/3 of the Roman Empire were slaves at one time. So, you know, I mean, it was even fathers could sell their children. Yollie, I see you, but I'll get you later. I got some other people in line here. You know, even a father could sell children into slavery if they wanted to. I think now I have got Ed or Bud.
Yeah, I would just like to come back to Dave Larson's comment with regards to sonship. My son sent to me about 6 months or so ago a book written by Ty Gibson, which was profoundly interesting and informative. It's entitled The Sonship of Christ, Exploring the Covenant Identity of God and Man. I can highly recommend it. It's less than 300 pages, little paperback. Very, very interesting, and it pretty well is a pretty good thesis with regards to Dave Larson's comments about sonship. That's it.
Well, what does it say?
Sir?
What does it say?
You know, this a political aspect that you've referred to, kind of an evolving declarative with regards to a lot of people, including Jesus. That's the best thing I can possibly say in a 30 seconds or so, David.
Wow, sounds interesting. Thank you.
Okay, Ladan.
Thank you. I wanted to bring up something that when you're talking about Jews at Moses or a little bit before Romans, we live in this society that we have judges and we have police and we have government and we have a lot of things separate from the church. And in the community that was dominated by religion and and their main government and sources was their church. And then Romans come in and bring the Pax Romana and all their laws, and they gradually separate the governance from the idea of religiosity. And so it's very easy for us to put ourselves in that position, says the Jews and them, and it really makes me cringe when I hear this from a lot of groups, the Jews, as if they're people of like, they have scales or they have horns, or, they're not us. What is it that they're not us? They're us. They're people. And, we talk about Jews as they're just like, they had different way of being. They didn't. They don't now. I think it's very easy to separate others from us because we think we're unique. Well, I don't know. We think that we have a luxury of not worrying about policing, and we have luxury of not worrying about if we don't go to church, we're okay. But they didn't have that luxury. A lot of Jews couldn't afford temple taxes, so they were outside. So they were shunned. And Jesus comes in there, he's a person. I many times think if Jesus was around, they would have killed him immediately. He's not a very popular person now. He was for distribution of wealth. Would he not be a socialist or a communist? He was for sacrifice. Why do we have these people not us? It's offensive. The Africans, they're not us. They're the non-Adventists, they're not us. The Jews, they're really not us. Sorry, it doesn't sound right to me. They're us. We are them. Thank you.
Okay, I have Eduardo. Are you there, Eduardo?
Hold on, I am. Can you hear me now?
Can hear you now.
Okay, Dr. Taylor, when I read Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "This is the word of Moses that spoke to the people of Israel." You said that somebody credited to Moses, and actually it's not written by Moses. Did you get my question, Forrest?
Yes, I did. Dr. Taylor's going to respond to you.
I heard a statement. I didn't hear a question.
Okay.
The question is that you said that somebody credited to Moses. That's true?
Yes, all that you said is true. The question is how to relate that. And by the time I have read the book, it is, well, it's not unlike Jesus in John 6. We start down by the lake and we find ourselves at the end sitting in a synagogue listening to a sermon, and nobody said how we got there. Obviously, what began as a story ends as an interpretation. And I think you recall that I said that it is placed in that setting. And you're right, it is. But the issues involved with it are more complex than that because, well, let me just put it this way. It ends up that Moses is recounting a history that hasn't yet happened.
Okay. I missed that, Bernard. Could you say that again, please?
Yes, I said it starts with Moses in the setting of Moses talking for the last time to the people. But when you follow the history and the context in which he places it in the city life, he's recounting history that hasn't yet happened.
Okay.
But David, can I ask you a question?
Is it right on this topic?
Yes.
Okay.
When I read the book of Deuteronomy, says Moses identified himself as the speaker or the writer of the book. Do you think that this is honesty when they said this is Moses speaking and actually is somebody else?
Well, you know, let me think about it this way. I'm sure that, and I need to be corrected on this, but I thought after the Babylonian exile, people brought things together. And that they created things too, but that they thought, rightly or wrongly, I would say rightly, that they thought that they were rightly reflecting the views that they had inherited. And so I don't picture them as creating as historical novels what happened, but I think of them as putting together their understanding of the situation in light of their issues. Now, if we read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, sometimes they'll tell the same story with different lessons. And I think that that is the sort of thing that's going on here. I think that there is very much a contribution from the time of the people who put Deuteronomy together in light of their concerns, but I don't think that they knew they weren't talking about, let's say, Plato. You know, their story of Moses was different than the story of Plato. And so there was some historical connection there. So I don't see it as either just pure historical novel or Moses just literally standing there, but some kind of mix of the two. But I'm not the expert in this. Let's get back to Bernard. It's a very, very important topic. So let's get back to him. What would you like to say?
Dr. Taylor, if you read chapter 4, verse 1.
Wait a minute. Let's get Bernard to respond.
Still muted.
Can we unmute Bernard? There we go.
You reversed the system unintentionally. These are issues that arise, and this is clearly, I think this is serving to illustrate that we have not read Deuteronomy in the larger context as that it was read in at the time. Sorry about that. I'll be quiet. I can't shut it up. In the context in which the book of Deuteronomy stands, looking forward. So the book of Deuteronomy casts a long shadow forward, and it is reflected in the books of Samuel and Kings. Now, Most people who read it never notice that this is the case, but that is in fact where it lies. And Deuteronomy stands apart because Deuteronomy talks about the place that God will choose. And that's off in the time of David. And yeah, it's not the inability of God to foretell the future that is in question here, but what, at least my question is, why would he do that? Why would people have to carry around in the desert and everywhere else this story that has nothing to do with them? They can't even relate to it. They don't even know the words that are used because it's not an urban society. And this is the nature of Scripture: intertextuality, reinterpretation in later contexts, in the spirit and power of Moses. Moses was a tremendous figure in their history, and somebody sat down and wrote in the context of the original message, a broader message that related to the people at that time. And that's the ongoing nature of story. And that is the method that God used to communicate. But we failed to hear that and failed to find the context of the New Testament in which that stood.
Okay, well, we'll come back to this because it's the fashioning of Deuteronomy is a good case study in how Scripture comes together. Who's next for us?
I got Yollie. Unmute yourself, Yollie. I'm trying to.
There we go. Okay.
There you go.
I had, and I still do have some personal insights regarding Jesus in his time and slavery and so forth. I hesitated to share those because in fear of being stoned, as you mentioned last week, maybe, in jest. But in reality, for a long time, I struggled with where was Jesus from, let's say, age 14 to 30. Because at the time that he lived, I felt for sure that he was an indentured servant. I really do. And I know it doesn't sound popular, but I really struggle with that still, because no one ever explained to me where he went. What was he doing between 14 and 30? That's it.
Good question.
Yeah, Jesus' silent years.
Mm-hmm.
The silent years of Jesus. I haven't got an answer to that, but I have a curiosity about it.
Yeah, me too.
Mm-hmm. What kind of teenager was Jesus? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He was so brilliant at 12, 13. He had to have been doing something between 14 and 30 that, you know, it's troubling to me not knowing where he was.
Does anyone have any insights into that? Is there any literature on that?
Well, you're not alone in that. And what the apocryphal Gospels, those not included in the canon, spend a lot of the time on are those silent years, because for the same reason. As you asked your question, I was thinking, you know, I don't know where you're coming from, but I think what we tend today, how could he waste those years? How come he never did anything significant? So in the Apocrypha, Jesus was a boy playing in Jerusalem, in Nazareth, and they would make clay animals, and he made clay animals. The difference was that he clapped his hands and his birds flew away. They came to life. And it was this sense of the miraculous which they produced to try and make his life significant. In fact, he got involved in a prank once, as they say, that somebody died. But it didn't matter. He just brought him back to life. And it is the fantastical, I think, which sets it aside. But it seems as though in the scheme of God, perhaps, that he was to live a quiet life. He wasn't an adult until he was 30. And he was obedient, and he waited, he was patient. And when the time came, Galatians 4:4 again, Rodney, and in the fullness of time, right on schedule. And everything went according to plan. How could he do that? But when he came to the end of his life, he said that his work was finished. He had done what he came to do. And there was this sense of manifest destiny, but which was built upon an inborn patience that enabled him to wait, unlike in the Old Testament, Goliath, no, the other one. Yeah, where am I? Acting, not waiting for God. Yes, David, thank you, Forrest. And, Abraham. Abraham and taking, not Sarah, the other one. So it doesn't fit. It causes wonder. But then if we can accept it as it is, perhaps we learn something from it about God.
David, can I share a thought about that?
I wonder if we need to stay with the queue, Eduardo. Let's get other people who haven't had a chance to speak, and then maybe we can come back.
Okay. Okay, I see Danilo. Are you ready to go?
Yes, sir. I was wondering, as far as Deuteronomy is concerned, I wonder if it served a similar purpose for Israel as Daniel and Revelation serve for us.
Would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, there is a way to deal with issues when some writer speaks of things not yet happening. So the question, therefore, is raised whether it was written by somebody else, perhaps at a later time, and credited to someone earlier. But that would essentially undermine the whole point of prophecy and revelation and issues of that kind. Today we have Daniel and Revelation, and we do not feel a need to credit those to somebody else simply because they are anticipating events well ahead of their time. So I'm just wondering if we could reason similarly about Deuteronomy.
Well, I'll jump on that one for a minute. Daniel is, by many scholars, is not thought to be written by someone from the 6th century, but rather the 2nd century. In the same way with Revelation, many scholars don't feel it's John the Apostle. So you can't say that no one thinks that way. I've also heard that Deuteronomy probably was either written or put together during the time of Josiah and happened to be the document found in the temple. So I can see what Dr. Taylor is going to, showing that it is a document that seems to be talking about the past as in the future. So I think we have to be open to all those views as well. I'm sorry to take up that, but I want to ask Rodney a couple questions if I can, Rodney, can I, you know, what do you think about, you know, the so-called Jews in Palestine being treated poorly, shabbily? Do you think that's kind of just whining rather than actuality?
No, well, the story is, and the stories that come to us, and maybe it's just the focus of the stories that come to us because we're raised Christians and we back up and we borrow the God, the Hebrew God, we borrow their stories, we borrow their Old Testament as it comes to us. And that's our body of knowledge and so much of our information. But the fact is, these are stories of continual oppression. I mean, where is the period of celebration for the Jews? Where was the period of sustained freedom? When did they realize the great expected promise of God to the children of Israel? It was a struggle after struggle after struggle. So I can understand why they got to the point where they were looking for a redeemer, a champion. And they had a couple in the past, and one was Moses. Some Jews were looking for the return, I think, of Ezekiel, but David was their last big hero. David was the high school quarterback, the high school champion. Everyone had wanted to be around that. The guy was the best dancer, the poet, the best athlete, the best warrior. David was the best of everything. He was their champion. And they were looking again, I think, for a champion. But I don't know if other countries went through the same, or nations went through the same oppression. You can follow up the early civilizations on both the Tigris River and the Euphrates, and man, were they vicious to each other. You can look at the history of the Egyptians and the stuff that went on there. Man, I'm glad I wasn't alive back then. I wouldn't survive probably past 12 or 14 years old. The amount of, and then you go to the early civilizations in the Andes. Wow, what are your chances of survival there? You know, so this was just a really rough time. So in the context of the era and the time, it may not be that remarkable, but the fact is, this is our spiritual, the Hebrew people are our spiritual ancestors. We borrow much from them, we owe much for them. And I have strong identification with them, strong sympathies for them. And yes, maybe under suffering, there's certain behaviors that are manifested that some people don't like. But as I said last week, there are days that I feel I have the soul of a Hebrew. And I don't apologize for that. That's part of my kinship, my spiritual kinship with these oppressed people.
Well, I would just like to throw out three things that I think that the Jews underestimated. First of all, they had good roads. You know, these weren't all necessarily dusty roads. They were good trade roads. They had the Pax Romana. They could go anywhere in the empire. And finally, they had the protection of the Roman army from the Parthians and armies from the east. So it just seems like they were getting a good value for their shekel.
Yeah. It's interesting, one of my Hebrew friends, when I was living in New York, and he was explaining from his point of view the development of Europe and the Western world. And he sort of took me to task. He said, well, Rodney, who built those roads? It was us Jews. Who taught the French how to cook? It was us Jews. And he went through all the nations of Europe that we give credit to for something. And he was saying, who was there at the time? Who were the slaves? Who were the people that were living in the cities that were doing the work? You know, it was us. And I actually, you know, asked him about, well, he took me to the, I want to keep this short, but he took me to the jewelry district in New York. And so I asked him, how come the Jews are so focused on jewelry and diamonds and gold? And why New York? And his answer was, it's really simple. We're persecuted people. We had to move, and we had to have money and our assets that were highly transportable. So as a people, we knew diamonds, and we knew gold, and we knew precious metals, because we're so often we had to grab them and run. And so when we got to New York, we got so tired of running, we decided to stay in New York. It was our promised land, and that's where we create our business. It's as simple as that, you know. So these little insights were beyond amusing, but it gave me the insights from a Hebrew point of view as to how they see it from enslavement and persecution. And without that knowledge, I would have totally misread it.
Thank you. I don't see anybody. Do I see any hands?
Yollie.
Yollie, again? Okay.
I will not go too far past my allotted words. I live in New York from 1971 to 1981. I became an American citizen when I turned 18 in New York City. And the Jewish people, they did, and I know they continue to do so many good work. They're very giving, they're very intellectual, but they're very humble as well. I spoke to someone who said a sign of demonic possession was a person's ability to learn language easily. There are many people from the Caribbean in New York City. They work as nanny for Jewish people. The Jewish people give them papers, and most of them learn to speak their languages, and the children love them as if they were their nanny. And I always speak well of the Jewish people because I've experienced them in a very, very good way. We live in an apartment building in New York City, and a man that we didn't even know taught all my sisters how to play the piano. Any kind of connection with them was always very, very positive. That's it.
Okay, I think Danilo, back to you.
I'm thinking back a little bit about our issues with time. We as human beings have a problem with time. If we look forward, we have a problem with that. And if we look backward, we have a problem with that. In fact, even in science, we can look at what happens over time, and we call it something moves with a certain rate, and we call that speed. If it's changing the speed, then we call that acceleration. And if there is a change in acceleration, we call that jerk. After that, we have nothing further to say. Even with all the mathematical analysis, we have trouble dealing with time. So, historically speaking, we frequently fall into the trap of denying the past simply because it disagrees with us, or we disagree with it. So we have Holocaust deniers, we have all kinds of issues, and sometimes during the wars, we literally do our best to undermine and destroy the other culture's history, so that they would be totally destroyed. And so the question comes to my mind, if we have so much trouble dealing with questions about time, can we really be a reliable source of understanding of anything that is either prophetic or historical? Because we are not trustworthy for this question, first of all, and second, we have limited capacity to even deal with it. So when I hear people revising documents and kind of recontextualizing them in various senses because it seems to suit their purpose a little more comfortably, I get very apprehensive.
Can I jump, Bill, Daniel, when I don't want to cut you off, but when you're done, I'd like to say something.
That's basically my concern. Thank you.
Okay, now if I can say this, and we need to get to Eduardo and McKinley, but what the premise of all we're doing is the idea that the original author controls the meaning of the text. And if the original author was well and truly Moses, that's one thing. But if we are talking about people who secondarily spoke in the name of Moses, then that gives us trouble. But I'd like to just read this from the introduction to the book, Thoughts from the Mount of Blessing, which suggests that the meaning of a text can be determined, at least in part, by us and not merely by the historical context. She says, let us in imagination go back to that scene. And as we sit with the disciples on the mountainside, enter into the thoughts and feelings that filled their hearts, understanding what the words of Jesus meant to those who heard them, we may discern in them a new vividness and beauty, and also gather for ourselves their deeper lessons. So the text can mean something to us that it may not necessarily have meant in whole to the original people. Now, you know, that's a different way of thinking about authority of the author and so forth. And I hate to go down that road too far, but it's an important street to travel a little bit.
David, just a thought that I might share in my kind of recycling here and kind of retrofitting some of my my thinking is I have to hold a basic premise in my thinking and my study, and that is that a God who cares about me and his people has to ensure that I and people get the basic message right. And so I'm comfortable with the notion of understanding and accepting the themes, the phrases, the paraphrases, as they embody the basic message. I don't feel that I need to take the bejeweled tweezers to the words. I can get the message without picking apart the word, or even sometimes a string of words. I can pull back and say, what is God's message here? What is he trying to tell me? What is the message to the people? And I just find that very, very useful. And I've warmed to ministers that take that approach. So that is my individual choice. It's my journey. I hold myself accountable to it. But underneath it all is it's not the authors of the books. Is the message of God clear to me? And can I trust that somewhere in the stream of information, the message that God wants me to hear is coming through to me? So it's thematic. It's not words and the necessary assembly of words. That's not communication. That's just construction. I'm not interested in construction. I'm not interested in the assembly of words. I'm interested in messages, and I'll focus on messages.
Thank you. Did McKinley, did you want to say something?
Sure, I'll share a thought or two. Thank you very much. Thanks again for the presentation, Rodney. As of last week, before the Sabbath school started, I said to myself, I want to listen very keenly and discern in the descriptions of the time that Rodney is going to talk about, any actions, any interventions of God as he moves his agenda towards the ultimate outcome, which is the coming of Christ. So one question that I have for you would be, where do we find in the experience of the Jews their vicissitudes, the interventions, or the movements of God? So that's one comment. before you respond to that, the second observation I'd like to share is on the question about what Jesus might have been doing in the years 14 to 30 years old. I will kind of just mention to the class from one of the Gospels when Christ was in the temple discussing with the elders and the lawyers there. I think he said, I must be about my Father's business. So it seems to me that if Christ had an early sense of his purpose, that sense of purpose continued in the years between 14 and 30. And I just sort of try to think about that in thinking about what would an Adventist child be doing in the years between 14 and 30 years old. I would think that they were likely going to be preparing for a life of purpose. At least that's my experience. And so I would think that in the years 14 to 30, even though there may not be any record of that from history, that Christ was quite busy preparing for his ministry later on in life. And then the final comment I'd like to share was a poignant observation that Ladan made about how people tend to refer to the Jewish people. And my thought is it possible that because Jews have a sense of destiny, a sense of purpose, that makes them rather distinctive, that this draws some attention to them? There's a uniqueness, I think, about the Jewish people that people don't know how to react to, or they try to understand. Sometimes I experience that when people don't know how to react to some of the insights I may share with them. So I'm not sure that it's sort of necessarily negative, but I find that to be an interesting aspect of the Jewish people. So I'll stop there.
McKinley, I love the way you think. I wish I knew you. I wish you would show your face on this Zoom so I'd have a greater sense of who you are. But I love your questions, and I love the way that that you think, and respect that enormously. So I'm going to come back and try and answer your questions in sort of a personal way, and I'll start with the first one, because I have to challenge myself and personalize and be responsible for my own journey and understand where is God in this journey. So as I've read through this period, I have reflected, and I'm going to, in 2 weeks' time, expand some of my reflections. I don't want to be drawn into playing God or pretend I'm playing God, but I have to understand it. So I have to enter the world of metaphors to understand that. And I do two things. And so the first one that I've done in my way of answering your question was, can I see the finger of God in this period? And my answer is no. There's too much blood and pain and suffering. Can I see the hand of God in all this? No, I can't account for the oppression and the ungodliness of so much that went on in this period. Okay? Can I see the shadow of God over this? Yeah, I can see the shadow of God. So I'm at the more of the macro level before I can see God. God as the civilizer, as it were. Higher up, the bigger place. God the strategist, which gets me to another little exercise I do on myself. I put two men. You can pretend that they're God and his son as strategic planners around a table in the morning over a good cup of coffee. Superhumans. They've got to move from one covenant to another. What has to be in place to ensure that this second covenant works out? The father's going to risk his son. It has to work. There's a lot at stake here. So the prerequisites of what has to be in place, the conditions have to be favorable. The timing is really critical here. And if I look at it from that framework of two really intelligent strategists who are planning how to launch new covenant that takes the message to the Gentiles. I can see God in that. But that's my personal journey and perspective, and I will share part of that if you would. But I'm going to challenge you folk here, everybody here, and McKinley, I know the way you think. I know the way you think. You're showing yourself. I would like you to answer your own questions in 2 weeks' time. Do some homework on that and share with us how you figure that out. But if we're going to buy that the Hebrew God, Yahweh, who we believe is the Father of Jesus, and when we pray, our Father which art in heaven, we think we understand who we're praying to, we better understand this connectivity and who we're praying to and who's being offered to us. We need to be clear about that. Otherwise, what are we doing here? So join that, give it some thought, and I'd be really interested in your comments on this. Our Father which art in heaven. Which Father? Who? Are we borrowing somebody else's God, and is it the right God? From my point personally, I profiled and studied all the gods that I can identify. This is my last chance God. This is my last chance God. The God of Judea, the Hebrew God. If this doesn't work, I go to the sidelines. I'm done.
Wow, that's powerful. You don't see the hand, you don't see the finger, but you see the shadow of God. Oh, that's interesting. I see Donna.
Yeah, Donna is up.
Well, I also responded well to Rodney's presentation, but I take a little bit of issue with his, sorry, Rodney, with your...
Go ahead.
With your comment about not being interested in the words, but in the message. A message cannot be conveyed without words, generally. I mean, certain kinds of messages, physical, when you embrace someone, you can look, love, but generally, certainly messages from a different time cannot be conveyed without words and without the structure within which those words are placed. So that's all I had to say about that. I just think that it's a little more complicated than trying to receive a message.
Yeah, I confess to oversimplifying. So Donna, thank you very much. But maybe this is something that Bernard could also address, is the assembly of Scripture. I mean, given that the compilation of the Septuagint and matters of compilation and document management holes for me, a deep hole for me, and that's maybe another topic for another time. But Donna, point taken.
Thank you. Eduardo has been very patient. Can we go back to him?
Donna I'm not quite done, David. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You go, Donna.
I wanted to say that the Jews, and perhaps this is tagging on a little bit to what both Yollie and Ladan said, throughout the Bible, especially the New Testament, those words and that label is often given to people who are, for some reason or another, presented in an unfortunate light. They're opposing Jesus, or they're planning some nefarious activity. And that is a reflection, I think, really of the 16th and 17th century, perhaps really the 16th, although it doesn't come out until 1611. So let's say 16th century and earlier centuries of anti-Semitism, that the translators of the Bible that really, even though we have all these new versions, most of us grew up with the King James, and it is sort of the standard, and certainly in my view, against which a lot of other things are tested. So the King James framed our thoughts and reflected the thinking of non-Jews in those centuries, so that it's both reflected and supported more anti-Semitism, and that's a problem. We have to somehow free ourselves of that bias, which is present throughout the scriptures, and perhaps especially in the New Testament. So that's all I was going to say.
Over.
Over now.
That does get back to supersessionism. I don't know if you ever want to have a session in the future on that issue, but I mean that comes out of this this period as well, and it's something I chose not to address, but it kind of sits there to be discussed.
Okay, that's all
Okay, we've got Eduardo now.
Okay, Rodney.
Keep it simple, Eduardo. Thank you.
When you said that you don't see the finger or the hand of God, but the shadow, are you not denying the scriptures? I know that David had the same idea. He don't see God in the killing of innocent and you know all the terrible deeds. Are not you denying the scriptures by saying that?
No, I don't think so, but maybe I'm pausing because maybe I'm not really understanding your question. So let me have one shot at it, and if you think I've missed the mark, then I'll give you another chance to phrase the question. Is that it's very difficult for me to see what I call the finger of God and the hand of God, which is very closely involved in a moment, situation of a moment, or a short period of time, a day, a week, or a month, when people are suffering and there's death and murder and narcissism and self-aggrandizement. It's not possible for me at this stage of my development, at this stage of my understanding, to see God in that. I can read it, but it's always comes back to the issue of where is God in this? In the moment-to-moment day of our lives, the moment-to-moment day of people and of a nation and of the Jewish people. And what God would allow this amount of suffering. And then you have to ask yourself, could I worship such a God that would allow such misery or be complicit in such misery? Hey, it gets too kind of complicated at that level for me. And so that's why I choose not to use that metaphor of the finger of God as a metaphor for moment by moment, short periods of time, event by event. That's what I mean by the finger of God. And the hand of God as in a daily or weekly, machination or control of events. And it's too difficult for me.
We're going to have to draw the meeting to a close formally now. This is the end of it formally. We can stay as long as we want to in addition to this, but we have concluded our formal meeting. I would like to say that I want to jump on what Rodney just said. Where is God in this? And my presumption is that God would be working somehow, somewhere during that intertestamental time, and we need to discern where that happened. I don't think there are some events where God is and other events where God isn't, but in every event, God is there in some way. And I take it that God is there as a healing presence and provocateur. So, yes, God was, in my view, active in the intertestamental period,
right.
But it may be harder to see what's going on there. Similarly, in our lives, when there are times when it seems that God has abandoned us. Even Jesus said that, right? My God, why have you forsaken me?
Yep. And I'm not challenging the story. I'm not challenging the story.
Even in those moments, God is present. Go ahead, Rodney.
I'm sorry. I'm just assuring Eduardo, I'm not challenging the story or the narrative at all. What the written word here. I'm only challenging myself and my ability to understand. And that's why I used the metaphors that I did.
But David and Rodney, that is basically my question. Are you not denying the story of the Bible by your understanding? Because when I read the Bible, or whoever reads the Bible, he's getting the picture through the message. This is God actions. Actually, God ordered the killing. I mean, the words express the message. And you are saying, I don't believe it. Well, that's another issue, believe it or not. But the issue is, are not you denying the scriptures by stating?
Eduardo, I gave you my best answer respectfully. I don't believe I'm denying the scriptures. That's the best I can do. I'm sorry.
All right.
Well, Eduardo, I'm not quite sure that I understand your point. That is, there's one issue is, why does the Old Testament attribute so much to God that we would attribute partially to God and partially to other things? And my thinking about that is that people were moving so hard against polytheism in the direction of monotheism that they attributed everything to God so as not to attribute it to any other gods. So, you know, I think that when we get to the New Testament, Jesus tells us that some things happen that God did not intend to happen. The rain and the sunshine fall on the good and the bad alike. Who sinned, this man or his parents? So by the time one gets to Jesus, Jesus is able to distinguish between human participation and divine participation. But at that time, and rightly so, I would say, people were moving away from polytheism, at least trying to move away from polytheism. And in that context, everything got attributed to God. That's how I would understand it, but I'm happy to have others jump in too.
All right, David, Danilo wants to say something, but I'm going to sign off. But I just want to say next week, I'm going to try to connect the dots up to the time of Jesus. And the other thing is, I appreciate Rodney talking about the Jews doing the food and all that. But I think you should read the book, How the Irish Saved the Western World. And so anyway, thank you again, Rodney, but I'm signing off. And then there's George Tichy after Danilo. Goodbye, everybody. Happy Sabbath.
Thank you, Forrest.
I've been struggling with a question similar to what Rodney was dealing with, but my question was a little different. It was dealing with, why does God allow love to be trampled so? You see how you have good things and they're trampled, and bad things appear to triumph, if anything. So this kind of question has bothered me for a good 40 odd years. And only a couple of years ago, a few days before, or was it 2 weeks perhaps before Christmas, one night I was getting to bed and I was wondering about this question yet again, for the umpteenth time. And it struck me, I didn't even know what were the right tools to think with. So I can really appreciate Rodney's position. It is one thing to observe things and to hold to truths. It is another thing to understand which particular truth I need to understand before I can actually have an answer to a question. And if you are missing something, you don't know what it is you're missing. I was convinced that I understood love. And so I could not understand, why would God allow love to be treated so badly? And that night, I had a dream somewhere around 2 or 3. And in the dream, I saw literally love in the form of a person trampled to the ground. In an open field, it wasn't like a trampling trying to get through the door. Like, this was deliberate. And several people were jumping up and down with both feet, as if being on the ground was not sufficient. They were trying to run it into the ground. I could not watch. It was so disturbing. but it was like the image was burnt in my brain. And as I watched, a wind rose up, and the wind blew away dirt and dust and garbage and the tramplers. And when the wind died down, love was still there. Then I understood what I was missing. You see, I was thinking that love was beautiful and right and good and sensitive and thus vulnerable, and so it deserved all of my protection and all of God's protection. But what I realized is that the people most in danger are the tramplers. Love was meant to be our protection, not to be protected by us only. If we see love as a source of strength to the person who loves, and not just a benefit to the one who's loved, then we begin to see things in a new light. And so I suddenly discovered that, yes, well, I do want the tramplers to have another chance. That's why they're allowed to do their trampling, so that we hope they will realize what they're doing. And yes, I want to love even if it hurts, not because it makes me virtuous or something, but it is the source of all strength that any one of us can have. I hope this helps in seeing not just a shadow, but also seeing some meaning when we're confronted with suffering.
One can almost hear Habakkuk in your questions, right? And Job. These are very important questions. Hard to answer, but very important. Who's next? We haven't heard anything from any psychiatrists or psychologists.
I guess I am. I was raising my hand.
Okay.
I am on, I guess. This issue about this human suffering in my journey has been a question mark forever. When I was a little kid, I don't know how in our home landed a small book that said, the title was The Human Suffering. And that was there through my adolescence and everything. I never read that book. But later on, but the title stick in my head. And that question remained in my journey through the years. I discussed with several people and all that. I cannot put together God's love as we define it with God's actions in terms of as described in the Bible. So much suffering allowed, so much suffering caused, carnage happening, and all that stuff that we know, we all know what I'm talking about. But that is always a question mark for me. So I cannot see God's finger or hand in so many situations. Maybe there's a shadow there, but no human being was able to give me at least something that was, you know, could satisfy my not question. I really bugged by that. I remember I exchanged communication. I communicated with Des Ford for many years. And I remember one time I addressed that. I said, what is your view of the human suffering? Because, and that was a kind of my last shot. That's the last person I'm going to ask about it. And again, he referred me some things that he wrote, and we discussed a little bit some issues, but it's still there. The problem is still there. And I like that approach, like the finger and the hand and the shadow. That's great. And I really like the presentation today. And but in the human suffering issue, I barely could see a shadow there. And so I don't have any question on that because I don't think anyone has an answer for that. Thank you. Happy Sabbath.
Thank you.
You know, there's only one intellectually serious reason not to be a Christian. All the other reasons are superficial or irrelevant. But there's only one, and that is one cannot believe that there is a loving God in this world.
Yes.
That's the only serious objection to Christianity. That's the only one. Every other one is beside the point or whatever. But, and I could tell you story after story after story of theologians and philosophers I've known that stopped right there. I'm thinking of Van Harvey, who wrote the theological dictionary with which I grew up. And I got to know him, and he stopped being a Christian. But he was also very protective of Christians in philosophical discussions and so forth. But one time he was asked, why did you stop being a Christian? He said, one day I woke up and I read the paper and I realized I couldn't believe it anymore.
Yep.
So it is a very serious issue. Joseph Fletcher, who was one of the most influential bioethicists, had a son who died slowly from cancer while he was a professor of Russian literature at Harvard. And Joseph Fletcher came to Loma Linda, and it became known, you know, throughout the bioethics community that he no longer believed in God. And so he was asked here at Loma Linda in private if that were so, and he said yes. And he said, you know, where I teach, people know I don't believe in God, but nobody asks me about it. I'm glad you folk at Loma Linda asked me about it. And the answer was, well, I watched my son slowly die.
I wonder if I can add to this conversation. So, sure. I think one way that I can sort of frame this is from my perspective, when I look at my life and the many ways in which God has, shall I say, guided my life, I can't come to a place where I can say that I don't believe in a God who is not loving. So that's just one sentence on that. But I think in the question we're dealing with concerning suffering, you remember, I think it was a Sabbath school class from March 27th where we're discussing the same question. And one of the books that have informed my understanding of that question is a book titled Saint Under Stress. I don't know if anybody has read that book. I don't know who the author is, but it's a book about Job's life, Saint Under Stress. And I'll recommend it as a good read. But in that conversation, I thought to share a couple of things. And the first one concerning suffering is that we live in an entropic environment. Things happen. Following the fall, suffering entered into our world. And not all suffering comes as a result of an action or inaction on God's part. The second point I made at that time was that God's character is on trial before the universe by the accusations of the enemy. And we all know who that enemy is. And I think in the midst of this dynamic, God's sovereignty allows him to exercise his divine prerogatives to sometimes foster his purposes. One of those purposes might be to expose the insidiousness of evil. And in this scenario, God allows an evil outcome to show how bad things can get if evil isn't checked. And I think he can do this because he is uniquely positioned to reverse the pain of that evil outcome and the experiences of that evil outcome. Another of his purposes might be to show his power in fostering a preferred outcome that might align with his governance of the earth. The other purpose that I shared at the time was to perhaps, hold particular people or circumstances to account. Perhaps evil has become too overwhelming, and this might allow God to intervene. And then the final purpose I shared at the time was for the individual to exercise all of the liberty and choices in the development and growth in a relationship with God. One of my favorite pastors preached a sermon once titled "Person in the Making." And it was a sermon about the life of Moses. And many of us will recall the whole experience of Moses, how he ended up murdering people in Egypt. He ended up going into exile. And then eventually, through all of those experiences, God was preparing Moses for a ministry. So I think as we think about suffering and the actions and interventions of God, it might be helpful for us to think about them in terms of a portfolio of purposes that God might be pursuing as he interacts with mankind. The final point is for us to always remember that we are all on a journey to understand who God is. And that journey is ultimately to lead to this consummate understanding, which is God is a God who exercises loving kindness, righteousness, and justice throughout the earth. So those are the thoughts I have to share on this particular topic.
David, can you give me a minute?
We can't hear you.
They can't hear you, David.
You need to mute yourself, David.
David, can you unmute?
Okay, I think it's Eduardo next and then George.
Okay, David. If you read the book of Lamentations, you will see a people in the middle of suffering. And their cry out is, God is just and good. Just go through this little tiny book of Lamentation. People on the worst suffering of the universe. And they are crying out, God is just and good. We misunderstand the mercy of God through the work of suffering. You need to organize a committee to start that issue because it's a world problem issue. People are losing their souls because this issue. You as a theologian, you need to organize a committee and deal with this issue. I wish you can do that so you can help the people. That's all I want to say, David.
Well, thank you. I'm so flattered that you think that a committee of us could solve this. It's gone all the way back to Lamentations. I think that your citation of Lamentations is most appropriate. I would like to just make 2 points here of a very practical nature, very practical. Number one, when we are with people, we don't give them theodicies. When we're with people who are suffering, we do what Jesus did at the tomb of Lazarus. Remember what he did?
Yes.
He wept. That's not the time in which to say, okay, I have X number of reasons why you're going through this pain. that's the time to enter into the feelings of the people and leave it elsewhere. But that's in John 11. Then we go over to Luke 13, and there Jesus is running a seminar for his graduate students off by themselves, and he just keeps hitting them with this question. Do you think these people were more evil? Do you think these people were more evil when the temple, the tower fell on them and so forth, where they were cut down in the temple? And in that context, Jesus is unrelenting in his forcing of the issue. But that's a very, very different context. We need to be sure that we do one thing in one context and the other in the other context. George, you're up to bat.
I'm sorry, I forgot to lower my hand, but just in case, I think that we could benefit from a comment from a psychiatrist. He's already smiling there, so probably he will kick in.
There's a couple.
Well, I tried earlier to get the psychiatrist to jump in, but I failed. Maybe you can.
Yeah, sorry, Elmer, but I think that as a specialist in, as you are, with children and adults, and as I observed you working through some years now and commenting, I'm sure that you have a lot of things in your well to share with us.
Well, someone brought up the fact that Jesus was obedient. I don't know how obedient this guy is. If I have a child who disappears from my side for 3 days, I'd be upset.
Mm-hmm.
Say that again, please.
Yeah.
Someone brought up the fact that Jesus as a child was obedient. I don't know how obedient he was. If my child were to disappear from my side for 3 days, I'd be very upset. And that's what Jesus did. He left his parents' side for 3 days and went back to Jerusalem at 12 years old. Nowadays, probably someone will call Child Protective Services and say, see what's happening with this kid in here.
And also preached his first sermon and alienated the family from the entire neighborhood. I mean, how did mom and dad think about that? So, yeah, but I'm going to check out here, but I want to thank everybody for a really enjoyable couple of hours. And David, I think one thing that we're missing here is, and it's in my reading, is I want to hear from the Hebrew perspective, from a Jewish scholar, how they see the suffering. We are Christians looking at a population of people, a civilization here, and ascribing certain behaviors and characteristics, but we are blind to interpretation from the Hebrew perspective. And then I want to thank Danilo for his deep dive down into his envisaging of love, and I found that useful as well. And but I think thank everybody for their comments. I really have enjoyed it. Lots of good thoughts, and enjoy the rest of your Sabbath. But I'll be checking out now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodney.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rod.
Thank you.
Chris, or Jeff, rather. I don't know how to.
Go ahead, Donna.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to figure out how to mute myself. I had a thought a little while back, and I think it's no longer appropriate. So I yield the floor to whoever's next.
David, let me say something here. You are correct that we shouldn't be talking doctrines to the sick people. But the sick people are questioning God's law. They want the answer. You don't start with doctrines, the temple, the Sabbath, the health message. But we need to focus on answer their question. Why me? Why this? Where is God? And that's why, I mean, you can do it. I mean, we can do it.
Eduardo, it's all about the timing. It's not what you say, it's when you say it that is far more important, especially when you're dealing with sick people or people who are grieving, people who are going through loss. It's the timing.
Well, yes. I suppose, Eduardo, I put your thumb on a bench, and I hit it as hard as I could with a hammer. It's going to be a while before you can entertain any theological notions that I might have. You're going to have some time to let that pain subside. It may take quite a while. So I agree with you, though, because I don't want to emotionalize every theological issue by saying all people need is a hug. No, they need answers, but time and place matters.
Yeah. And then one other thing too, even what to say becomes a challenge. I'll share that I have a cousin who's an Adventist pastor, a young fellow who's gone blind. And it's been really, really difficult for us to understand how this young man and his wife also had brain surgery for a tumor, but who's so on fire for the Lord could be going through this experience. And yet, when I talk to my cousin, he is as ever on fire as he was before his blindness happened. And even when I talk to him, I don't know how to encourage him. When you can sort of sense in the conversation the challenges of a young person not being able to see, so even as we talk about how to encourage people who are suffering in the moment, in the reality, it becomes a challenge to even talk through that.
May I say something?
Sure.
I think the most irritating thing is that when you struggle with an idea and a question and somebody else comes up and has all the answers and presents to you without bona fides, what is it that answers all your questions and puts it in a box and presents it to you? And when it doesn't do anything, it challenges your unfaithfulness. I think sometimes we have to be very careful that people are in different places in their journey. And even if you're a whatever expert in one field, doesn't necessarily make you an answer of questions that are based on a lot of assumptions. The truth of the Bible is based on a lot of assumptions. And you'll have to accept that, a gift of faith. Somebody may not have that. So when you come up and answer the question based on certain things, how is that an answer to a question that somebody's struggling with? You have to have basic similar ideas, basic journey, place of time and place. And you have to accept that, okay, I'm going to accept a set of beliefs and they will comfort me. How do you know a person is there to throw ideas and answers to?
Very difficult.
Jesus wept, and that's all he did.
Very difficult.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Please don't go ahead and present boxed answers to people. That's not helpful at all.
Ladan,
Yeah.
we have freedom of speech. We can express ourselves.
No, you don't. I'm sorry. A person has to give you permission to speak and present solutions. You do not have freedom. Otherwise, you're just throwing your pearls to people who don't appreciate that. You don't have freedom.
In America, we do. In America, we do have freedom of speech.
We're talking about freedom of speech in two different ways as to whether we're talking about a political freedom or whether we have the freedom to talk to people about their issues without their permission. And I think those may be distinguishable.
No, but I don't think I'm breaking any rules, David. I don't think that I'm breaking any rules.
Go for it.
You're breaking mine if you give me solutions that I haven't asked for you. Maybe I don't even give you the the respect that you will have it. Why would you think that I would take it?
The reason that you are in the Sabbath school class, you are, you know, you put yourself in a place that you have to deal with other people's ideas.
That's right.
If you don't want to listen to me, either you go away or I go away.
Okay.
So
well, I think we may need to clarify something here. I don't hear her saying that she doesn't want to hear from you or anybody else. I hear her saying, you can't address my personal problems without my permission. And I think that's a different issue. And so I think you agree with that, Eduardo. If you have some issue that you're working with, you don't want me to. I've had people come up and tell me, I can tell you what you need to do to change your life to make it better. And I feel like saying, okay, well, I'll ask you when I need your help, but I'm not going to ask you for you right now. Why don't we call it a day and think about what we've been talking about and reconvene next week, no later than 10:30. Come on earlier if you can talk a little bit before we get going. Thanks a lot, everybody.
God bless you.
Thanks, David.